Viridian, the Green Guide by My Head in the Clouds, Not Coming Down. Chapter 16. Investigation. Shoto looked over the file for the crab villain as he waited for Tsukachi to arrive so they could interrogate him. Of all the trigger dealers he had shaken down over the past few years, most just evaded his questions and a few tried to run, but no one else had shot up before he had a chance to ask a single question. In Shoto's line of work, a reaction like that meant the person had something to hide. According to his file, the crab villain was named Ju Hamasaki, and some mid-level dealers had pointed Shoto his way, saying that he sold them the drugs. He couldn't be anywhere near the top. He didn't have anywhere near enough connections to bring drugs over from America, but he was the highest level dealer Shoto had found so far. Everything pointed to Hamasaki knowing something, which is why he had fought tooth and nail, even against a kid like Viridian. Shoto took a deep breath and reminded himself that trigger often induced rage. Hamasaki probably hadn't been thinking entirely clearly when he almost killed Viridian. Shoto tried to ignore the voice in his head that said he'd been thinking clearly when he dosed himself, and he clearly knew what would happen. It wouldn't do any good to punch Hamasaki in the face the moment he entered the interrogation room. But that didn't mean Shoto had to like the guy. Tsukachi calmly walked through the door of the station and put his trench coat on the chair at his desk. "Sorry I'm late, Eraser. I was having lunch with an old friend." Shoto grunted in response. "Are you ready?" Tsukachi nodded and took the file, leading Shoto into the room where Hamasaki was waiting. They had to pass through the observation room first, which meant Shoto got a good look at the villain through the glass. He had expecting the guy to be defiant, considering how hard he'd fought to avoid being arrested. But instead, Hamasaki was pale and jittery. He looked terrified. Tsukachi saw him staring. "He's been like that ever since you brought him in. We've been trying to tell him he's safe here, but he obviously doesn't believe us. It definitely lends credence to your assumption that he actually knows something." Shoto nodded and followed Tsukachi through the door. They both sat down at the tables opposite Hamasaki, who looked even worse close up. One of his hands was tapping at the table, and a thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead, despite the fact the room was air-conditioned. He had information. That much was certain. The only problem now was getting him to talk. "All right, you know why you're here," Tsukachi began. "Eraser picked you up a few days ago for trigger possession and assaulting a pro-hero, both of which have prison sentences attached. However, the law is willing to be lenient and take time off your sentence if you provide us with useful information." Hamasaki shook his head. I don't know anything." "You fought tooth and nail to avoid answering my questions," Shoto said dryly. "Who sells you the trigger?" "I don't know who you're talking about." Hamasaki glanced up at the cameras, and Shoto frowned. Was he scared of a dirty cop? That couldn't be. Sure, the trigger operation was growing, but villains had to have a significant amount of power to pull a cop to their side, and that took time. Trigger had only been in Japan a few years, so he had to be scared of something else. "We could try to find a way to sweeten the deal," Tsukachi tried. "Surely there's something that would make your life more comfortable behind bars. Maybe protective custody?" "It doesn't matter how comfortable your cell is if you never live to see it," Hamasaki muttered. "We have resources to protect you," Shoto said. "Who's ever behind the trigger, they can't be powerful enough to reach you in witness protection." "You're underestimating him," Hamasaki said darkly. "You think it's just some guy in their mom's basement, but that couldn't be further from the truth. You don't know what you're dealing with." Shoto looked at Tsukachi, who leaned forward. "Then tell us. Who are you afraid of?" Hamasaki hesitated, then slammed his mouth shut. "No, I ain't saying nothing else." "Well, then I guess we'll just have to learn the hard way." Tsukachi stood up. "Come on, Eraser. This guy obviously doesn't want to tell us anything. It's his fault if we die because we don't know who to avoid." Shoto stood. He wasn't sure Hamasaki was going to be so easily manipulated. But Tsukachi had already made his move, and, well, it was worth a try. They certainly weren't going to get anything by bargaining. To his surprise, they hardly opened the door to leave when Hamasaki spoke up. "No one's ever seen him." Shoto and Tsukachi shared a glance, then closed the door and sat back down. "It's just one man?" Tsukachi asked. "Behind the whole trigger operation?" "It's bigger than you think," Hamasaki said softly. "It's not just Trigger. But just stop looking into it. He's too powerful. You'll never stand a chance." So the man behind the Japanese trigger operation had a fierce reputation. It wasn't the first time Shoto had run into a villain who used his reputation to make sure people didn't fight back. Most of the time, these guys were all bark, no bite. They all talked up their quirks and connections, but were B-ranked villains at the worst, not the S-ranked ones they made themselves out to be. "Do you have a name?" Tsukachi asked, "so we know who to avoid." Hamasaki shook his head. "Nobody knows his name, but they call him the symbol of evil." Shoto narrowed his eyes. The symbol of evil? Like a play on the symbol of peace? No wonder people were so scared of this guy if he made himself out to be All Might's equal. He glanced over to Tsukachi, surprised to see the fear on his expression as well. He had to know that this symbol of evil was bluffing, right? Suddenly, a piercing alarm split the air, making all three of them flinch. Sansa came running into the room not a second later, fur on end as he yelled, "There's a villain attack right outside. We need all hands on deck." Shoto swore and ran outside, hands already on his capture weapon. There was a small crowd outside, and civilians were screaming as they ran away from a dozen or so minor villains that were attacking at random, like they were trying to do the greatest damage in the least amount of time. The media vultures were already starting to pull up and film, though they at least had the good sense to stay away from the main fight. The villains were more like thugs, but there were still enough of them to be dangerous if Shoto didn't take them down quickly. He activated his quirk and looked at the closest one, some guy with bullets shooting out of his fingers, then quickly wrapped him up and flung him towards the waiting police, and then started in on the next one. Rocklock had turned up while Shoto had been fighting, so he managed to take down one of the villains by locking a rope in place around him. Between the two of them, it only took another 10 minutes to round up all the villains and get them into police custody. It wouldn't have taken so long if there weren't so many of them. Gangs hadn't been a problem since All Might became #1, so how had so many thugs decided to attack the police station at the same time? They had to be pretty stupid to attack a place that they knew was filled with police. Even if they weren't scared of the cops, pro heroes were always in and out of the station. So why attack? It just didn't make sense. Slowly, they managed to get all the villains off the street and into the holding cells inside of the station. There was going to be so much paperwork. Thankfully, most of it would be done by the police themselves. But still, Shoto wasn't looking forward to it. That could wait, however, until he and Tsukachi finished interrogating Hamasaki. The attack had terrible timing. They had just been starting to get useful information when they both had to leave to handle the attack. So hopefully they'd be able to just pick up where they left off, though Shoto wasn't getting his hopes up. It had been a miracle that they'd been able to get as much as they had out of the guy, and the attack would probably have spooked him silent. It was annoying. He tracked down Tsukachi, and together they made their way into the interrogation room. Shoto almost didn't bother looking through the window before entering, but when he did, he had to do a double take. He looked at Tsukachi to make sure he wasn't seeing things before they both swore and barged into the empty room. "This is the same interrogation room, right?" he asked. "This is where we left him?" "Yes." Tsukachi looked pale. "He was still cuffed to the table when we left." Shoto looked more closely at the room. The cuffs were gone as well, which wasn't normal for an escape. Most of the villains would pick the cuffs, then leave them behind so they wouldn't be slowed down by the dead weight. If Shoto didn't know better, he would say that Hamasaki had never been there at all. Tsukachi was already striding back out into the bullpen. "Sansa, What happened to the villain we were interrogating in room 6? Shoto followed to see Sansa at the front desk looking through the logbooks. It says that he was transferred, but that can't be right. The villains were blocking the front entrance. So, I suppose they could have taken him out the back. But the attack was taking up almost all our manpower. The person who transferred him also forgot to sign their name. Pull up the security feed, Shoto said. The cameras must have caught them leaving. Samson grimaced. One of the villains' attack missed their target and hit the power box. We just barely got lights on 5 minutes ago, but the station was in a blackout for most of the attack. So the cameras weren't recording, Tsukachi clarified. No, sir. Shoto looked at Tsukachi and could tell he was thinking the exact same thing. The attack wasn't random. Neither was the power outage. The entire thing had been engineered by someone who didn't want Hamasaki to talk to them. Shoto had been wrong. Whoever was behind the trigger operation was more powerful than he thought possible, and the only lead he had was the symbol of evil.